He posed as a groom to watch her, then realized she was as trapped as he was, 1891. The autumn rain fell in cold sheets across the Vandermeer estate in Hyde Park, New York, turning the carriage drive into a river of mud and the stable yard into a treacherous mirror of sky. Thomas Brennan stood in the doorway of the tack room, watching the main house through the downpour, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of weak coffee. 3 weeks he'd been here now, mucking stalls and brushing down horses, playing the part of just another Irish immigrant grateful for work. 3 weeks of watching, waiting, and learning the rhythms of this gilded cage. He'd come here with a purpose as sharp as a blade, to find evidence that would destroy Edmund Vandermeer's reputation and financial empire. The man had ruined Thomas's father, stolen his shipping contracts through lies and manufactured debt, then watched as Patrick Brennan drank himself to death in a Boston tenement. Thomas had spent 2 years gathering information, following threads, building a case, and every thread led back to this estate, to secrets buried in ledgers and locked safes, to whispers of fraud that could bring down one of New York's most powerful families. But before you hear how this story ends, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Now let me tell you about the moment everything changed. It happened on his 22nd day at Vandermeer Hall, when he saw Catherine Ashford standing in the stable yard at dawn, her riding habit already soaked through, her dark hair escaping its pins. She was Edmund Vandermeer's ward, the orphaned daughter of his late business partner, and according to the other servants, she was to marry Vandermeer's son Philip in the spring. Thomas had seen her before, of course, glimpsed her through windows, watched her take tea on the terrace, observed her moving through the house like a ghost. But that morning, something was different. She stood in the rain with her face turned up to the sky, and Thomas saw tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. Then she walked straight to the stable, past the main entrance where the riding horses were kept, back to the small paddock where they kept the old mare scheduled for sale. Thomas followed at a distance, curious despite himself. This wasn't part of his mission. Catherine Vandermeer, or Ashford technically, was simply another piece of the family structure he needed to understand. But when he rounded the corner and saw her pressing her forehead against the mare's neck, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. "Miss!" he called out, keeping his voice rough and accent thick, the way all the Irish workers did around the family. "You'll catch your death out here." She spun around, startled, and for the first time he saw her face clearly. 23, maybe 24, with grey eyes that held more exhaustion than any young woman should carry. There was a bruise on her left wrist, barely visible beneath her sleeve, and when she saw him looking, she quickly pulled the fabric down. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steadier than he expected. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone. I just wanted to say goodbye to Duchess before they take her away." "Goodbye." Thomas moved closer, pretending ignorance he didn't feel. He'd heard the head groom complaining that Mr. Vandermeer wanted the mare sold, despite Catherine's protests, that the animal was too old to be worth keeping. "Mr. Vandermeer says she's no longer useful." Catherine's hand trembled as she stroked the mare's muzzle. "He's selling her to a renderer tomorrow, for glue and—" She couldn't finish. Thomas had learned many things about Edmund Vandermeer in his weeks here. The man was ruthless in business, cold to his servants, and wielded control over his household with absolute authority. But this casual cruelty toward an animal, executed specifically to hurt the young woman in his care, revealed something darker. "That's a shame," Thomas said carefully. "She looks sound enough to me." Catherine laughed, a bitter sound. "Sound enough for anyone but him. He wants to teach me that attachment is weakness, that everything and everyone can be replaced." She looked at Thomas directly for the first time, and he felt the weight of her intelligence behind those exhausted eyes. "You're new here, aren't you?" "Thomas something." "Brennan, miss." Thomas Brennan. Irish? Boston these days. Before that, County Clare. She nodded, studying him with unexpected intensity. You're educated. I can hear it beneath the accent you're putting on for the others. Thomas's heart hammered. He'd been so careful. Just picked up some reading over the years, miss. Don't. She held up a hand. I'm not going to tell anyone. I'm tired of everyone here pretending to be something they're not. She turned back to the mare, her voice dropping. Including me. For a long moment, they stood in the rain, two people playing roles neither wanted. Thomas knew he should walk away, maintain his cover, keep his mission clear. Instead, he heard himself say, "What if she didn't have to go?" Catherine's head snapped up. What? The mare? What if there was a way to keep her safe? Mr. Vandermeer has made his decision. Mr. Vandermeer doesn't need to know everything that happens in his stables. Thomas moved closer, speaking quietly. My cousin runs a small farm in Poughkeepsie. Good land, needs a steady horse for ploughing. If Duchess disappeared tonight, if the renderer arrived tomorrow to find her already gone, he'd be furious. With whom? The new groom who doesn't know any better, who thought he was helping by finding her a buyer. Thomas met her eyes. It's not much, but she'd be safe. She'd have good years left. Catherine stared at him, and Thomas saw calculation behind her exhaustion, a keen intelligence weighing risks and possibilities. You'd do that, for a horse you don't know, to help someone you just met. I'd do that because some creatures deserve better than what powerful men decide for them. The words hung between them, meaning more than either acknowledged. Catherine's hand moved unconsciously to her bruised wrist again, and Thomas saw understanding flicker across her face, the recognition that they were talking about more than just a mare. Tonight, then, she whispered, after the house goes dark, I'll bring her papers and enough grain for the journey. No. Thomas shook his head. You stay clear of this. If it goes wrong, you need to be nowhere near it. It's my horse, Mr. Brennan. If I'm going to lose her, I'll at least say goodbye properly. They arranged to meet at midnight. Thomas returned to his quarters above the carriage house, his mind racing. This wasn't part of his plan. He was supposed to be invisible, gathering information, finding the evidence he needed to expose Edmund Vandermeer's fraud. Getting involved with Catherine Ashford was a complication he couldn't afford. But that bruise on her wrist haunted him through the rest of the day, as did the exhaustion in her eyes, the desperate loneliness of someone trapped in a cage made of social expectations and family obligations. That evening, as Thomas prepared for the midnight meeting, he pulled out the leather notebook where he'd been documenting everything he learned about the Vandermeer family's business dealings. There were pages of notes about shipping manifests, forged contracts, payments to corrupt port officials. But now he added a new section, starting with a simple question. What else is Edmund Vandermeer hiding? The house went dark at 11:30. Thomas waited another 20 minutes, listening to the other grooms settle into sleep before slipping out into the night. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with fog, turning the estate into a landscape of shadows and suggestion. Catherine was already at the stable when he arrived, wearing a dark cloak and carrying a small leather case. "Her papers," she explained, handing it to Thomas. "And a letter for your cousin explaining her care. She has a sensitive stomach, needs special grain mix twice daily. I'll make sure she gets it." They worked together in silence, preparing the mare for travel. Thomas had arranged for a cart and borrowed a docile gelding to pull it. As they led Duchess out of her stall, Catherine suddenly stopped. "Why are you really here, Mr. Brennan?" Thomas went still. "Excuse me? No, you're not just a groom. You watch the main house too carefully. You ask questions about Mr. Vandermeer's business partners your first week here. And tonight, you're risking your position for someone you don't know." She moved closer, her voice barely a whisper. "So I'm asking, Why are you really here? He could lie, should lie. Instead, Thomas found himself holding her gaze and saying, "Because Edmund Vandermeer destroyed my father. Because everything he's built is built on fraud and stolen contracts. Because men like him never pay for what they do unless someone makes them. You're here for revenge. I'm here for justice." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What if I told you I could help? That I know where he keeps his private ledgers, the ones he shows no one? Why would you betray your guardian?" "Guardian," she laughed bitterly. "Is that what he is? The man who killed my father to steal his business, who took me in to maintain appearances, who's forcing me to marry his son to legitimize his control of my inheritance." She pulled back her sleeve, showing Thomas the full extent of the bruise. "This was from yesterday, when I suggested postponing the wedding. So tell me, Mr. Brennan, who exactly would I be betraying?" The fog swirled around them, two conspirators in the darkness, their careful masks finally stripped away. Thomas knew he should be cautious, that this could be a trap, but something in Catherine's voice, in the raw pain behind her words, rang true. "The wedding is in spring? March 15th, 6 months away." Catherine's jaw set with determination. "Which means we have 6 months to find what you need, to build a case against him that can't be ignored. 6 months to escape these cages he's built for both of us." Thomas looked at her outstretched hand, pale in the moonlight, and knew that taking it would change everything. His mission had been solitary, driven by personal grief. Now she was offering partnership, shared risk, and something far more dangerous, hope that he wasn't alone in this fight. He took her hand. 6 months, then. They moved Duchess quickly after that, loading her onto the cart and securing her for the journey. Thomas would take her to Poughkeepsie himself at first light, using his scheduled day off. As Catherine helped him adjust the mare's lead, their hands brushed, and Thomas felt an electric charge he hadn't expected. "I should go," Catherine whispered, "if the kitchen staff wakes and finds me gone." "Tomorrow night," Thomas said. "The rose garden at midnight. There's a bench behind the fountain where no one can see from the house." Catherine nodded and disappeared into the fog, leaving Thomas alone with the mare and a growing sense that he'd just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The trip to Poughkeepsie took most of the next day. Thomas's cousin Sean ran a modest farm on the outskirts of town, and he asked no questions when Thomas arrived with the mare, just nodded and promised she'd be well cared for. On the ride back, Thomas tried to sort through the complications Catherine Ashford represented. She was Edmund Vandermeer's ward, his victim, and potentially his most powerful ally against the man. But she was also a woman trapped in circumstances that made any relationship between them dangerous and likely impossible. Thomas had come here seeking justice for his father, not romance. Yet he couldn't stop thinking about the determination in Catherine's eyes, the intelligence behind her exhaustion, the courage it took to stand in the rain and offer rebellion against the man who controlled her entire life. When he returned to the estate that evening, the head groom informed him that Mr. Vandermeer had been in a rage about the missing mare. The renderer had arrived to find her gone, and Edmund had interrogated every stable hand. Thomas played his part perfectly, confused, apologetic, explaining he'd found a buyer willing to pay slightly more and thought he was doing the master a favor. Edmund had him docked a week's wages but kept him on, apparently satisfied that simple stupidity rather than defiance was the explanation. "You're lucky," the head groom muttered. "He's dismissed men for less. But I think Miss Catherine put in a word for you. Said she'd told you to find the mare a better situation. Took the blame herself." Thomas's chest tightened. She'd protected him, at cost to herself. He could imagine Edmund's reaction, the cold fury he'd direct at Catherine for the perceived betrayal. That night, Thomas waited in the rose garden, watching the house windows go dark one by one, Autumn in the Hudson Valley meant early frosts, and his breath came out in clouds as he paced behind the fountain. He was beginning to think Catherine couldn't get away when he heard footsteps on the gravel path. She emerged from the shadows wearing a heavy cloak, her face pale but composed. "I'm sorry I'm late. Edmund kept me in his study for hours, lecturing me about my responsibilities and proper behavior." She sat on the bench, and Thomas saw her wince slightly. "Did he hurt you?" "Nothing visible. He's learned to be careful about that." Catherine pulled her cloak tighter. "But we don't have time to discuss Edmund's discipline methods. If we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it." For the next hour, they planned in whispers. Catherine explained the layout of the house, where Edmund kept his business office when he was typically absent. She'd lived in Vandermeer Hall for 5 years since her father's death, watching and learning, storing up knowledge she'd never thought she'd use. "He keeps 2 sets of books," she explained. "The official ledgers his accountant sees, and private records locked in a safe behind the portrait of his father in the upstairs study. That's where the real business is documented. The bribes, the forged contracts, the deals that would ruin him if they became public." "You've seen inside the safe?" "Once, years ago, before he knew I was paying attention. He keeps the combination written in a small red notebook in his bedroom desk." Catherine's voice was steady, but Thomas could hear the fear beneath it. "The problem is access. He's home most evenings, and his valet sleeps in the adjoining room." "What about during the day?" "He goes to the city every Thursday for meetings at his club, takes the morning train, doesn't return until evening." Catherine met Thomas's eyes. "But we'd need a reason for me to be in that part of the house during the day, and for you to be anywhere near the main house at all." Thomas thought for a moment. What if there was a problem with the pipes? Water damage threatening the library below his study. "I've done enough handyman work that I could be sent to investigate. And you'd naturally be concerned about the books, want to supervise the repair." "That could work." Catherine leaned forward, and Thomas caught the scent of lavender from her hair. "But we'd need to actually create the problem first. Make it believable. Leave that to me." They met 3 more times that week, always at midnight in the rose garden, planning and preparing. Thomas learned details about Catherine's life that made his anger toward Edmund Vandermeer burn hotter. Her father, James Ashford, had been Edmund's partner in a shipping venture. When a warehouse fire destroyed most of their inventory, James had wanted to file an honest claim, take the loss, and rebuild carefully. Edmund had insisted on inflating the insurance claim, forging documents to show inventory that didn't exist. "My father refused," Catherine said one night, her voice distant with memory. "Said it was fraud, that he wouldn't be part of it. 2 weeks later, he fell from the warehouse loading dock. They called it an accident, said he'd been drinking, but my father never drank, Mr. Brennan. Not once in his life." "Thomas," he said quietly. "Call me Thomas." "Thomas." She tried the name, and he liked the sound of it in her voice. "My father died, and suddenly Edmund was my guardian. My mother had passed when I was 12. I had no other family. Edmund took control of my inheritance, moved me into his house, and began planning my future." Her hands clenched in her lap. "Philip was supposed to be charming, was supposed to court me properly, but he's as cold as his father, and just as controlling. Last month he told me that once we're married, I won't be allowed to keep any correspondence with friends, won't be permitted to leave the house without his approval." "That's not a marriage," Thomas said, anger sharp in his voice. "That's ownership." "Yes." Catherine looked at him directly. "Which is why I need this to work, Thomas. It's not just about justice for what Edmund did to your father, or even what he did to mine. It's about my entire future." The weight of her trust settled on Thomas's shoulders. This was no longer just his vendetta. He was responsible for Catherine's freedom now, and the thought both terrified and motivated him. On Thursday of the second week, Thomas executed his plan. He spent Wednesday night carefully creating a slow leak in the pipes running behind the library wall, positioning it so water would seep down gradually but noticeably. By Thursday morning, the head butler discovered moisture staining the library ceiling and immediately sent for Thomas, who'd been carefully establishing a reputation for having a knack with repairs. Thomas examined the damage with appropriate concern, then informed the butler that he'd need to access the study above to find the source. Edmund had already left for the city. Catherine appeared moments later, expressing worry about the valuable books below, insisting she needed to supervise and document any damage for insurance purposes. The butler, overwhelmed and grateful for Catherine's organizational skills, agreed immediately. Once alone in Edmund's study, they worked with silent efficiency. Catherine knew exactly where Edmund kept the small red notebook. Her hands shook slightly as she opened the desk drawer, but her voice was steady as she read out the combination. 18-7-32. Thomas moved to the portrait of Edmund's father, a stern-faced man with cold eyes remarkably similar to his son's. The safe was exactly where Catherine had described, hidden behind the painting's ornate frame. His fingers worked the combination slowly, carefully. The lock clicked open. Inside were stacks of ledgers, correspondence, and legal documents. Thomas had brought a small camera, an expensive piece of equipment he'd purchased specifically for this mission, trained himself to use over weeks of practice. Now he photographed page after page with methodical precision, while Catherine kept watch at the door. "Thomas," she whispered urgently, "there's a letter here. It's about my father." He moved to her side and read over her shoulder. The letter was from Edmund to a man named Morrison, dated 1 week before James Ashford's death. The contents made Thomas's blood run cold. It outlined a plan to remove the obstacle of James's moral objections, suggested that accidents happen in warehouses every day, and promised Morrison payment for services rendered. "It's a murder confession," Catherine breathed. "He killed my father. He actually—" Her voice broke, and Thomas caught her as her knees buckled. "Easy," he murmured, steadying her. "I've got you." For a moment they stood there, Thomas's arms around Catherine, both of them facing the documented proof of Edmund Vandermeer's evil. Then Catherine straightened, pulling herself together with visible effort. "Photograph it," she said. "Photograph everything. We need evidence that can't be questioned." They spent the next hour documenting the contents of the safe. By the time they finished, Thomas had photographed forged contracts, bribery records, extortion letters, and evidence of fraud spanning 15 years. Edmund Vandermeer had built his empire on corruption, and now they had proof. They restored everything exactly as they'd found it, closed the safe, and rehung the portrait. Thomas made a show of repairing the pipe leak while Catherine documented imaginary water damage in a notebook. By the time Edmund returned from the city that evening, everything appeared normal, but nothing was normal anymore. Thomas lay in his narrow bed that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Catherine's face when she'd read the letter about her father. Thinking about how she'd felt in his arms for that brief moment, how right it had seemed, despite all the impossibilities between them. He was falling in love with her. The realization came with absolute certainty and considerable dread. Catherine Ashford was beautiful, yes, but it was her courage that captivated him, her intelligence, her refusal to accept the cage Edmund had built for her. She was everything he hadn't known he wanted, and everything he couldn't have. Thomas was a stable groom, an Irish immigrant with no fortune and a family name destroyed by scandal. Catherine was a wealthy heiress from old New York money, destined for a society marriage regardless of what happened with Philip. Even if they succeeded in bringing down Edmund Vandermeer, even if they freed her from the engagement, there was no world in which Thomas Brennan and Catherine Ashford could build a life together. But in the rose garden the next night, when Catherine arrived with her face glowing with cautious hope, he couldn't bring himself to care about impossibilities. "I spoke with my father's old attorney today," she said breathlessly. "Mr. Harrison, the one Edmund wouldn't let me contact before. I sent him a telegram saying I had questions about my inheritance, and he agreed to meet me in the village tomorrow." She gripped Thomas's hands. "Thomas, if we can show him the evidence, if he believes us, he has connections to prosecutors in Albany. He could help us build a legal case. Meeting him is a risk. If Edmund finds out, I'll be careful. I'll say I'm visiting the seamstress for wedding dress fittings." The word wedding came out bitter. "Edmund won't question that. He's been pushing me to order the dress for weeks." Thomas wanted to argue, to insist she stay safe, but he saw the determination in her eyes and knew it would be useless. Catherine had been passive for 5 years, playing the obedient ward. Now that she'd chosen action, nothing would stop her. "Then I'm coming with you," he said. "I'll drive you in one of the carriages, play the part of a servant attending his mistress. That way, if there's any trouble—" "Thomas, you can't risk your position." "My position doesn't matter, you do." The words came out more intensely than he'd intended, hanging in the cold November air between them. Catherine went still. "Thomas." "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's impossible. I know I have no right. But I need you to be safe, Catherine. That matters more than the evidence, more than revenge, more than any of it." "It's not impossible," she whispered. "Maybe it should be, maybe it's foolish and reckless, but it's not impossible." She stepped closer, and Thomas found himself reaching for her, his hands cupping her face gently. "If we do this," he said hoarsely, "if we act on this, it makes everything more complicated, more dangerous." "I don't care." Catherine's eyes shone in the moonlight. "For 5 years I've been half alive, doing what I was told, accepting my fate. Then you arrived with your secrets and your mission, and suddenly I remembered what it feels like to want something, to fight for something. I'm not giving that up, Thomas. I'm not giving you up." He kissed her then, unable to resist any longer. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet, full of promise and uncertainty. When they broke apart, both of them were trembling. "6 months until the wedding," Catherine said softly. "We have 6 months to build our case, expose Edmund, and find a way to be together. That's enough time. It has to be." Thomas held her close, breathing in the scent of lavender and feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that justice and love could triumph over wealth and power. But he'd learned hard lessons about how the world worked, about how men like Edmund Vandermeer always seemed to win. Still, with Catherine in his arms, hope felt almost possible. The meeting with Attorney Harrison went better than either of them dared expect. The old lawyer listened to Catherine's story with grave attention, examined the photographs Thomas had taken, and confirmed what they'd suspected. The evidence was damning. With proper presentation to the right authorities, it could destroy Edmund Vandermeer completely. "But we must be careful," Harrison warned, speaking quietly in the private room he'd rented above the seamstress shop. "Edmund has powerful friends, judges, politicians, businessmen who profit from his corruption. If we move too quickly, if word gets back to him before we're ready, he could destroy the evidence and disappear. Or worse." "Worse?" Catherine asked. Harrison's expression was somber. "He killed your father, Miss Ashford. Don't doubt he'd do the same to you if he felt cornered." The words hung heavy in the small room. Thomas moved instinctively closer to Catherine, his hand finding hers under the table. "What do you recommend?" Thomas asked. "Time," Harrison said. "I need to build relationships with prosecutors we can trust, people beyond Edmund's influence. I need to verify the evidence independently, gather supporting testimony from others he's hurt. And most importantly, we need to ensure Miss Ashford's safety when this becomes public. He looked at Catherine seriously. Your inheritance is substantial. Once Edmund is exposed, his control over it ends, and it reverts to you. But in the interim, you'll be vulnerable. They spent the next hour planning carefully. Harrison would work discreetly, building the case through his legal connections. Thomas and Catherine would continue gathering any additional evidence they could find, and Catherine would maintain her role as obedient ward, giving Edmund no reason for suspicion. What about the wedding? Catherine asked quietly. It's scheduled for March 15th. If we haven't acted by then, we will have, Harrison assured her. I'll file the necessary legal documents by February at the latest. The wedding cannot proceed once Edmund's guardianship is challenged in court. On the carriage ride back to the estate, Catherine was quiet, processing everything. Thomas drove carefully, hyper-aware of her presence behind him in the passenger compartment. When they were nearly home, she knocked on the small window that separated them. Thomas stopped for a moment. He pulled the carriage to the side of the country road, and Catherine stepped out, insisting they both needed air. They walked together along the edge of a fallow field, the November wind cutting through their coats. I've been thinking, Catherine said, about what happens after. Assuming we succeed, assuming Edmund is arrested and my inheritance restored, what then? Then you're free, Thomas said. You can go anywhere, do anything, live the life you were meant to have. And you? Thomas shrugged, trying to sound casual. I'll have justice for my father. That's what I came here for. Catherine stopped walking and turned to face him. Is that really all you want? Justice and then what? Back to Boston? Another stable job somewhere? Pretending these months never happened? Catherine, I'm a groom. You're an heiress. Once you're free of Edmund, you'll have your choice of suitors, men of your own class, with education and position, and I don't want men of my class, Catherine interrupted fiercely. I've met them. I've watched them at dinner parties and society balls. They're Edmund in miniature, controlling, entitled, treating women like property to be acquired. She stepped closer. You asked me once why I would help you, why I'd risk everything to betray my guardian. It's because you're the first person in 5 years to treat me like an equal, to ask what I want instead of telling me what I should want. That doesn't change reality. The world we live in, the rules of society, rules made by people like Edmund. Catherine's eyes flashed with defiance. I'm going to be wealthy in my own right, Thomas, independent. I won't need a husband for financial security or social position, which means I can choose based on what actually matters: character, courage, honesty, love. Thomas's heart hammered. You deserve someone who can give you everything. You're right, Catherine said softly. I deserve someone who sees me, truly sees me, someone willing to risk everything for what's right, someone who kisses me in rose gardens and makes me believe in futures I thought were impossible. She reached up to touch his face. I deserve you, Thomas Brennan. And if you'll have me, once this is over and we're both free, I'd like to build that future together. He kissed her then, deep and desperate, pouring 5 years of grief and anger and loneliness into it, and feeling her response with equal intensity. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. Yes, he whispered. God help us both. Yes. They returned to the estate separately, Catherine first in the carriage, Thomas following 20 minutes later on foot, maintaining the illusion of propriety. But everything had changed. They weren't just allies anymore, not just conspirators seeking justice. They were lovers planning a life together, with all the complications and impossibilities that entailed. The next weeks passed in a blur of secret meetings and careful maneuvering. Thomas continued his stable work, playing his role perfectly while gathering additional information whenever possible. Catherine maintained her facade of obedient ward, attending social functions with Philip, discussing wedding plans, acting the part Edmund expected. But in stolen moments, brief encounters in hallways, past notes hidden in stable records, midnight meetings in the rose garden, they built their real relationship. Thomas told Catherine about his childhood in Boston, about his father's pride before Edmund destroyed him, about the anger that had fueled him for 2 years. Catherine shared memories of her parents, her grief, her terror when she realized she was trapped in Edmund's control, and slowly, beneath the danger and deception, they fell deeper in love. December arrived with heavy snow that blanketed the estate and made their meetings more difficult. One night, Catherine couldn't get away at all, and Thomas spent hours waiting in the freezing rose garden before accepting she wasn't coming. He returned to his room above the carriage house, anxious and frustrated, only to find a note slipped under his door. "Edmund suspects something. He questioned me today about my trips to the village, about my sudden interest in the estate finances. I told him I was trying to be more prepared for married life, to understand Philip's future business, but I don't think he believed me. Be careful. Destroy this note." See, Thomas burned the paper immediately, his mind racing. If Edmund was suspicious, they were in danger. Harrison had said he needed until February to build the legal case properly, but if Edmund discovered their plan before then, it would all collapse. The next morning, Thomas was mucking out stalls when the head groom appeared with orders. Mr. Vandermeer wanted to see him in his study immediately. Thomas's blood ran cold. He cleaned up as quickly as possible, put on his least dirty shirt, and made his way to the main house. A maid escorted him upstairs to Edmund's study, the same room where he and Catherine had photographed the evidence just weeks before. Edmund Vandermeer sat behind his massive desk, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the cold eyes of a predator. He studied Thomas for a long moment before speaking. "Brennan, is it?" "Yes, sir." "You've been with us about 3 months now." "Yes, sir, since September. And in that time you've made quite an impression. Good work with the horses, initiative in finding a buyer for that useless mare, even demonstrated some handyman skills with repairs." Edmund leaned back in his chair. "My ward, Miss Ashford, speaks highly of you, says you've been very helpful." Thomas kept his expression neutral, though his heart was pounding. "Just doing my job, sir." "Of course." Edmund's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, Brennan, what brought you to Hyde Park? You're from Boston, I understand. Long way to travel for stable work." "Heard there were good positions in the Hudson Valley, sir. Better than what was available in the city." And your family? What did your father do?" This was dangerous ground. Thomas chose his words carefully. "Shipping business, sir. Small operation. It failed a few years back." "Shipping?" Edmund's expression didn't change. "Interesting coincidence. Miss Ashford's father was in shipping as well. Did you know that?" "I'd heard something about it, sir." Edmund stood and moved to the window, looking out over the snow-covered grounds. "I've built everything you see here, Brennan. Everything. I started with nothing, a clerk in my father's office. And through hard work and careful planning, I created an empire. Do you know how I did that?" "No, sir." "By understanding leverage, by knowing people's weaknesses and using them." He turned to face Thomas directly, "By removing obstacles before they became problems." The threat was unmistakable. Thomas held his ground. "I'm not sure I follow, sir." "Don't you?" Edmund moved closer, and Thomas could smell expensive tobacco and brandy. "I know men, Brennan. I know when someone is playing a role, presenting a false face. You're educated beyond what you pretend. You watch things too carefully, and you've become remarkably close to my ward for a mere stable hand." "Miss Ashford is kind to all the staff, sir." "She is, Edmund agreed, which is why she needs guidance, protection. She doesn't understand how easily kind young women can be taken advantage of by ambitious young men with nothing to lose. Thomas met his gaze steadily. I've never been anything but respectful to Miss Ashford. See that it stays that way. Edmund returned to his desk, opening a ledger as if the conversation was finished. You're dismissed. And Brennan, I'll be watching you very carefully from now on. Thomas left the study with his pulse racing. Edmund suspected him, though he didn't seem to know the full extent of their plan. But the warning was clear. They were running out of time. He managed to slip a note to Catherine that evening through one of the kitchen maids who was sympathetic to their cause. They met in a new location, an abandoned ice house on the far edge of the property where no one would see them together. He knows, Catherine said without preamble, or at least he suspects. Thomas, Philip told me tonight that they want to move the wedding up, to January instead of March. Edmund said something about not wanting to wait any longer, about securing our union sooner. He's trying to trap you before we can act. Thomas paced the small space, his mind racing. We need to contact Harrison, tell him we're out of time. I already sent a telegram. He's coming to meet us tomorrow, same place as before. Catherine's voice was steady, but her hands shook. Thomas, what if we can't do this? What if Edmund moves too quickly? He pulled her close, trying to transfer some of his certainty to her. Then we run. I have money saved, enough to get us far from here. We could go west, start over where Edmund's influence doesn't reach. That's not justice, Catherine said against his chest. That's not what your father deserves, what my father deserves. No, Thomas agreed, but keeping you safe matters more. If it comes down to justice or losing you, there's no question which I choose. Catherine pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I love you, Thomas Brennan. I don't think I've said that clearly yet, but I do. Completely. I love you too. The words came easy, natural. We're going to get through this, together. The meeting with Harrison the next day was tense. The attorney listened to their news with growing concern, then outlined their options. I can file emergency paperwork challenging Edmund's guardianship, he explained. Claim that Miss Ashford is being coerced into marriage against her will. That would at least delay the wedding while the courts investigate. But it's a weak approach without the criminal evidence, and Edmund could potentially fight it successfully. What's the alternative? Thomas asked. We accelerate the criminal case. I bring the evidence to the federal prosecutor in Albany now, before all my groundwork is complete. It's risky. We'd be relying heavily on the photographs and hoping the prosecutor can act quickly enough. If Edmund gets wind of it before arrest warrants are issued, he could flee. Catherine looked between them. What would you recommend? Harrison was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I think you should leave, Miss Ashford. Take what money you can access and disappear. You could contest the guardianship from a safe distance, claim your inheritance once Edmund is dealt with. It's not perfect, but it keeps you out of immediate danger. No, Catherine's voice was firm. I won't run. My father didn't run when Edmund pressured him to commit fraud. He stood his ground, even though it cost him everything. I owe him better than to just disappear. Your father didn't know what Edmund was truly capable of, Harrison said gently. But I do. Catherine straightened her shoulders. Which is exactly why I need to see this through. File the criminal case, Mr. Harrison. Bring the evidence to the federal prosecutor. We'll deal with whatever comes. Thomas wanted to argue, to insist they choose the safer path. But he saw the determination in Catherine's face and understood that this was about more than safety. It was about reclaiming her agency, refusing to be Edmund's victim any longer. Harrison left to catch the afternoon train to Albany, carrying the photographs and his documentation. Thomas and Catherine returned to the estate separately, both knowing they'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The next days were agony. They couldn't risk meeting, couldn't communicate beyond brief, careful glances across the grounds. Thomas worked and waited, watching the main house constantly for any sign that Edmund knew what was coming. On the fourth day, a telegram arrived for Edmund while he was at breakfast. Thomas heard about it from the kitchen staff. The master had gone pale, then red with rage. He'd immediately ordered his carriage prepared and left for the city without explanation. An hour later, Catherine appeared at the stable, her face flushed with excitement and fear. "Federal marshals," she whispered quickly. "They're coming to arrest him. Mr. Harrison got the warrants approved. Edmund knows. Someone must have tipped him off, but he can't run. They've frozen his bank accounts, impounded his ships. It's happening, Thomas. It's actually happening." By evening, Edmund Vandermeer was in custody in New York City, charged with fraud, bribery, extortion, and murder. The arrest made headlines in every major newspaper. The scandal rocked New York society, one of their own exposed as a criminal, his empire built on corruption and death. Catherine was immediately removed from the estate by attorney Harrison, who took her to stay with his own family while the legal proceedings unfolded. Thomas gave his statement to federal investigators, providing context for the evidence and explaining how he'd infiltrated the household. The trial came in February, swift by legal standards. The evidence was overwhelming. Edmund Vandermeer was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. Philip, who'd been complicit in some of his father's schemes, received a lesser sentence but was financially ruined. And Catherine's inheritance, substantial and no longer under Edmund's control, was restored to her completely. Thomas didn't attend the trial. He'd returned to Boston after giving his statement, feeling suddenly adrift. His mission was complete. Justice had been served. Edmund Vandermeer would spend the rest of his life in prison, paying for what he'd done to Patrick Brennan and James Ashford and countless others. But without the driving force of revenge, Thomas didn't know who he was anymore. He took a room in a modest boarding house and tried to figure out what came next. The letter from Catherine arrived in mid-March, on what would have been her wedding day. Thomas, I haven't heard from you since you left for Boston. Mr. Harrison says you testified at the preliminary hearings, but declined to attend the trial itself. I understand, I think. You came for justice, and once you had it, the story was finished. But Thomas, this isn't just your father's story, or even my father's. It's ours, and I refuse to believe it ends with us apart. I've spent the last weeks settling my father's estate, establishing my independence, and figuring out who Catherine Ashford is when she's not playing a role. The answer is someone who wants to build something meaningful with her life, someone who wants to use her resources for good, to help people trapped in circumstances beyond their control, and someone who is absolutely, certainly in love with you. I'm buying a house in Boston. Nothing ostentatious. I'm finished with that world. Just a comfortable home in a good neighborhood. There's room for two if you're interested. Room for a life together if you'll have me. Warnil, I know we come from different worlds. I know society would say I'm foolish for choosing a life with you over the comfortable future my wealth could buy with some appropriate society husband. But I've learned that society's rules are often written by men like Edmund, designed to maintain power for the powerful and keep the rest of us in our designated places. I'm done following those rules. If you want this, want us, come to 47 Beacon Street on April 1st at noon. I'll be there, waiting. No pressure, no expectations. Just hope that the man I fell in love with in rose gardens and abandoned ice houses might want the same impossible, improbable, wonderful future I want. All my love. Catherine. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his heart pounding harder with each reading. She was offering him everything, love, partnership, a future beyond what he'd ever imagined possible. And she was doing it on her terms, not as a wealthy woman condescending to rescue a poor man, but as an equal choosing a partner. On April 1st, he stood outside 47 Beacon Street at 11:50, wearing his best suit and carrying a small bouquet of roses from the flower cellar on the corner. His hands were shaking. The door opened at precisely noon, and Catherine stood there, more beautiful than he remembered. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair down around her shoulders, and when she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that made all his doubts disappear. "You came," she breathed. "Did you doubt I would?" "Every minute." She stepped aside to let him in. "Welcome home, Thomas." The house was lovely. Not palatial like Vandermeer Hall, but warm and welcoming. Catherine gave him a tour, pointing out the library she was establishing, the small garden she was planning, the room she'd thought could be his study. "I've been thinking about what to do with my inheritance," she said as they settled in the parlor with tea. "I can't just sit on that much money while people suffer. I want to do something meaningful." "Like what?" "Legal advocacy, maybe. Helping people trapped in situations like I was. Women stuck in guardianships, workers exploited by employers, immigrants cheated of wages. Attorney Harrison says he'd be willing to work with me, teach me what I need to know." She looked at Thomas hopefully. "And I thought, if you were interested, you might help. You understand what it's like to be powerless, to watch someone you love be destroyed by people with more money and influence. We could build something together, Thomas. Something that matters." Thomas set down his teacup and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands. "Catherine Ashford, are you asking me to marry you?" She laughed, tears streaming down her face. "I suppose I am. Very improperly and completely backward. What do you say?" "I say that 3 months ago I came to Hyde Park with nothing but anger and a plan for revenge, and somehow, impossibly, I found you, found love I didn't know I needed, found purpose beyond destruction." He kissed her hands. "I say yes, to marriage, to partnership, to building something meaningful together, to all of it." Catherine slid from the chair to join him on the floor, and they held each other, both crying and laughing, overwhelmed by the impossibility of their happiness. They married quietly in May, with Attorney Harrison and his wife as witnesses, in a small ceremony that would have scandalized Catherine's old social circle. Thomas didn't care. Catherine was radiant in a simple white dress, and when she promised to love him for the rest of her life, he believed her completely. They built their life together slowly, carefully, learning to be partners in all things. Catherine studied law under Harrison's guidance, while Thomas used his business knowledge to help manage her charitable foundation. Together, they helped dozens of people escape situations of exploitation and abuse, using Catherine's money and Thomas's street-smart understanding of how power operated. Years later, when people asked Catherine why she'd chosen the life she had, why she'd married her former groom rather than any of the wealthy suitors who'd come calling after her inheritance was restored, she always gave the same answer. "Because Thomas saw me when I was invisible. Because he treated me as an equal when everyone else saw property. Because he taught me that the cages we're born into aren't permanent, that courage and justice and love can break even the strongest locks." She'd smile then, looking at her husband with undimmed affection. "And because he was the only man brave enough to meet me in rose gardens at midnight and plot revolution." Thomas would always add, "and because she was the only woman brave enough to help a foolish Irishman with a revenge plan turn his anger into something better, something healing." They had their struggles, moments when society's disapproval cut deep, when financial pressures mounted, when the trauma of what they'd survived threatened to overwhelm them. But they faced everything together, two people who'd learned in Edmund Vandermeer's shadow that freedom was worth fighting for, that love was worth risking everything, and that the impossible could become real if you were brave enough to reach for it. In the end, that was the truth that mattered. Thomas Brennan had come to Vandermeer Hall seeking justice for his father, and he'd found it. But more than that, He'd found Catherine, and she'd found him, and together they'd built a life more meaningful than revenge could ever be. A life of purpose, partnership, and hard-won joy. A life worth every risk they'd taken in those cold autumn nights, plotting in rose gardens and betting everything on the impossible hope that love could be stronger than the chains that bound them. They won that bet, and they spent the rest of their lives grateful for the courage it took to make it.